Professor Chatterjee made several contributions in diverse areas of statistics, and one of his prime contributions is in the area of multivariate nonparametrics. Now, there is an interesting history related to how he got involved in multivariate nonparametrics. It so happened that in 1962-63, Professor S.N. Roy visited the statistics department in Calcutta University and gave a series of lectures, and he was working on multivariate nonparametrics at that time, and that had quite a bit of influence on Professor Shauthi Chatterjee. And at that time Professor P.K. Sen was also in the department, and so they both got quite influenced by the lectures of Professor S.N. Roy and decided to start working on multivariate nonparametrics. Now, Professor P.K. Sen was actually working on these problems for some time before Professor Chatterjee got interested in it. So, in a way he was ahead of Professor Chatterjee, and Professor Chatterjee has always acknowledged that in various writings. They together did several work and published a few papers. The basic problem they looked at is how to extend these univariate nonparametric procedures to multivariate problems. For example, how to extend the univariate sign test to multivariate sign test, or how to extend the Wilcoxon sign test to multivariate problems, or Wilcoxon rank test to multivariate problems, and things like that. Now, one of the major problems there is that when you deal with the multivariate data, the distribution free nature of the univariate nonparametric tests, it's difficult to retain them, because multivariate distributions, or the class of multivariate distributions, are usually very large, and so you often lose distribution free property if you try to extend those tests in a very naive and straightforward way, and that was the biggest challenge. And in S.N. Roy's lecture, Professor Roy highlighted that. Anyway, so one of the major contributions of Professor Chatterjee and Professor Sen was to develop this idea of conditional tests, which is kind of related to permutation test that was developed earlier. So, their approach was to look at the distribution of the statistics conditionally on the unordered set of rank vectors, and as you do that, because you are looking at conditional distribution given the unordered set of rank vectors, you can work out the distribution irrespective of what is the unknown true distribution of the original data is. That was the main contribution, and they worked out two sample tests, multi-sample test in the multivariate problems that way. They mostly worked on bivariate problems, but many of the things that they did can be extended to multivariate problems. At the same time, Professor Chatterjee came up with an interesting idea of extending sign test. Now, the multivariate extension of sign test was considered about 10 years ago by Joe Hodges and others, and they had a test and its properties were nicely worked out in the literature. The approach of Professor Chatterjee was different from that, and it was based on the coordinates. It was quite different, and Professor Chatterjee worked out the conditional approach for implementing the test, and I happened to read his paper, which was published in the Annals of Mathematical Statistics at that time. And if you read the paper, particularly the concluding section, he is making a lot of interesting comments, and it's very clear that those comments are really made in response to the criticisms from the referee. It's my guess, probably Joe Hodges or some of his students were the reviewer. So there is a lot of points, and he has nicely responded to many of them. Now, one of the key problems that he was sort of trying to address is that his procedures were not affine invariant, whereas the earlier procedures were affine invariant. On the other hand, his procedures were invariant under some other set of transformation. In any case, so Professor Chatterjee continued this work with Professor Sen until Professor Sen left Calcutta University in late 60s and went to University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And in 1972, Professor Chatterjee went to University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill for 1 year, and there the collaboration between these two people continued, and they considered not only the two sample problem, they considered various regression problems and non-parametric tests in the context of regression problems. And Professor Chatterjee also worked out a test for symmetry under non-IID setting based on a Kolmogorov-Smirnov type test. The difference between the earlier work on sign test or many of these rank tests is that they were essentially based on some strong assumptions of symmetry in the underlying distribution, like elliptic symmetry or some such thing. Whereas the bivariate sign test that Professor Chatterjee worked on, it was under a very general setting. It was essentially testing whether 0 is in some sense the median of the distribution. There is no otherwise there was no symmetry assumption that he considered. And Professor Chatterjee has also mentioned in some places that when he was in Chapel Hill, he was exposed to this idea of contiguity and martingales due to Professor Sen, and these are usually the fundamental tools used in working out the theoretical properties of non-parametric tests, for example, their asymptotic efficiency and large sample properties. I think this is what I am telling here is sort of an overall summary of what Professor Chatterjee did in the area of multivariate non-parametrics. See, he worked on these things, he started working on these things shortly after his PhD research. In his PhD work, he worked on Stein type procedures in sequential analysis, and then he moved on to this area, and he continued working in this area till end of 70s, and then he moved on to other areas like design of experiment. Later on, his passion was foundational problems in statistics.